SMEs, the engine room of the UK economy. Great opportunities for them in the transition to net zero, but of course a lot of risk as well, because as the big companies change, the SMEs are in the supply chain. As the banks move towards net zero in their portfolios, they're going to need the emissions of the companies they back to be reported and to move into transition mode.
We do a lot with landlords throughout the UK and further afield, and as anyone will tell you, there's a huge problem with data gathering for SMEs and helping them on their decarbonisation journey.
And what we've been trying to do is work with and work in partnership with different organisations, with different individuals, not just from government, but from NGOs and from business, to drive real change.
All of this combined to ensure that our government at home is making the right decisions and acting on our climate crisis.
I think what it is about holding the UK government's feet to the fire. Rishi Sunak gave a strong speech, but actually the delivery we've seen from the UK has been slow and sort of erratic, both in domestic policy and how we've been supporting people. Are you enjoying it? Yeah.
And SMEs, I think you're absolutely right, are the lifeblood of this country, not just of business, but actually of the societal impacts of it. And those SMEs are the people we now need to think about in so much detail.
The banks can help as well facilitate by getting some very simple tooling into them to do the carbon calculation, to do that ESG scoring, to make sure that they can participate in the future in these sort of supply chains.
That video was edited together from sound bites that we gathered from key stakeholders on the ground when we were in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the ambition of it was to set out for you this evening the challenges that SMEs are facing and the challenge that Bankers for Net Zero is trying to address with its SME workstream over the next 12 months going into COP28. So I would like to ask my panellists to introduce themselves, because I think people always introduce themselves better than I would. And also, if you could each just tell me just one thing that you took away from COP27, whether you were there or not, this year. Brendan, to you first of all.
Sure. First of all, thanks to SEC Newgate.
That's right. Well
yeah, I did ask Heather just before, is it SEC or SEC Newgate? For inviting me to speak. And obviously, been working with Heather and Bankers for Net Zero for a while. So great to see all the work that's been done. And I was at COP. I did briefly drop into the Green Zone to see the Transition Plan Task Force announcement, but didn't get invited to get interviewed that time. I feel disappointed. I feel I could be bigger pulled than some of those MPs. But no, I think I work at the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE, London School of Economics, as a policy fellow, working primarily on sustainable finance, but very much focused on what role does finance have in driving a just transition. Professor, you may know, he's more well known than myself, obviously, Professor Nick Robbins has been doing work on this dating back to about 2017. And we set up something called the Financing the Just Transition Alliance, or the FAHITA, which Nick always says is about the only funny thing in the just transition. But we do a lot of work.
There's got to be something.
Yeah. But we do a lot of work with financial institutions, banks, primarily as well as place-based actors, trying to get that link between public and private finance to drive local climate transitions as well. And what was the question?
COP27.
COP27, one takeaway. There's many, but I think on a personal takeaway is that we're going to need to see a huge amount more blended finance to deliver on the transformation of the financial system that was laid out in the final agreement at Sharm el-Sheikh. I think for those that might be aware of blended finance, there's a Convergence report that showed that it has been actually trailing down year on year between last year and this year. So that trend needs to be reversed, and we need to be thinking about what are the mechanisms to bring in private finance, concessional capital alongside more commercial capital to actually drive behind not just the just transition, but things like adaptation as well are really going to need that. So there hasn't been enough of that, but hopefully we're going to see a lot more.
More to come. Wendy.
Hi, so I'm Wendy Hewell. I'm Head of ESG and Climate Change at Santander for the corporate and commercial banks. So my role encompasses literally everything at the present time, working right across the board, supporting our clients, supporting our colleagues, and looking at the data that we require to answer whether it's the ECB or the UK regulator, And then also looking at all the data and how we really do support our customers. So your points with regards to COP27, I wasn't there. And actually I wrote a piece for our colleagues to try and take out what were the learning points. And for me personally, listening to Antonio Guterres, his opening speech and his closing speech were really, really powerful. But how do we get that message across? And how do we really help people, support people to thinking about, they've managed to get the loss and damage fund agreed, but not who's going to pay into it. And to Brendan's point, mitigation, adaptation, are we moving fast enough, or actually were we going backwards? So there's a lot of work for all of us to do. And I think one key point is, the Paris Agreement was in 2015. We said that by 2030, we hope to reduce emissions by 50%. We're halfway there already. We've got 7 years left to really facilitate and move quickly.
Charlie.
Thanks. I'm Charlie Ogilvie. I have the most out-of-date job title. I'm the strategy director for COP26, which sort of worked quite well for a couple of years. Last year has been a slightly harder sell. I ended up coordinating UK government's COP27 programme within the COP unit in Cabinet Office, so the negotiations and the events in the pavilion and the presidency's platform and the wider comms, etc., and obviously thinking about how all the levers that HMG can pull in international climate, from our ODA programme in our ICF spend, our participation through the Gs in conversations about financial reform, etc., how all of that can kind of come together to create a successful political moment. My headline reflection on COP27 was that we didn't create a very successful political moment. I think there was progress made, and the issue of loss and damage has been, an extremely difficult and very valid political ask of the developing world for some time. And it was important that we made progress, but we did not use that moment politically to drive forward on other areas of, what we need to do to deliver against our Paris goals. I think if there's one particular piece that might be of interest to this discussion, the H-leg group, the SG's group on standards and transparency around particularly corporate target setting, reported back early in the COP. I think largely reiterating things that we already knew about how companies should be planning for the transition. It was interesting that happened a week before the Treasury launched its, the TPT, so the Transition Planning Task Force report on corporate transition planning and how we regulate corporate transition planning. There was discussion in the negotiations about transparency and integrity. And my sort of question coming from that is, where is this process leading this set of outcomes around the greening of finance and the greening of business? At the moment, answers are being found and questions are being asked, but that next 3 or 4 years, as regulatory processes start to converge with voluntary action, standard setting starts to be adopted more widely, and national government level policy starts becoming a major driver of change. How does that all come together? Is that a role for the COP, or is the COP simply a kind of enabling political platform for that conversation? So that was one of the big questions that I left wondering about after Sharm.
So one role for us this evening, by the end of the night, we're going to get Charlie a new job title. So all together, we'll figure that one out. Heather, over to you.
So Heather Buchanan, obviously director, the chief executive and co-founder of Bankers for Net Zero. And obviously, this whole idea of SMEs was, and how they're supported in the transition, was really the kind of nascence of the Bankers for Net Zero project, which was supposed to be a one-year project that we started in 2019 leading up to COP26. And obviously world events kind of overtook us, and in 1 year turned to 2. And during that time, we became very involved with both the Cabinet Office and with the COP presidency and the Race to Zero and the formation of GFANZ and the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So that's kind of the journey that got us to being the first kind of country chapter in the world. But ultimately, the nascence of the project was a discussion that I had in Portcullis House with Louise Roper, who's the chief executive of Valence, and where we were discussing that we knew that there were going to be kind of pressures to clean it for financial institutions to clean up their balance sheets moving forward. Just as post 2008, there was a pressure to clean up balance sheets from commercial property. That came really quickly, and everybody had to react really quickly. We said, well, sometimes with poor social outcomes, and we just said, well, let's start having a conversation early about all the conflicting interests and messages and regulation and policy that's going to happen as we go through, as we basically reset the economy and work towards decarbonisation. And how do we make sure that businesses and people are supported as much as possible? And there's always going to be winners and losers, and people are going to go bust, and some people are going to thrive, in any normal economy. But how do we make sure that as we're fundamentally changing what risk and value look like, which is a pretty big ask for an entire financial sector that's managed to kind of evolve over hundreds of years, and we're saying in a couple of decades we need to get this sorted. How do we make sure that we get that support in? And so this piece, and this SME piece, is absolutely at the heart of why we started this. What is the external pressures and the eventually what the commitments of financial institutions made? What does that actually look like on the ground? And how do we try to kind of connect some of the dots to make sure that we have a glide path rather than cliff edges along the way? So, and in terms, I think, in terms of I was at COP obviously for the whole time. Chaotic and frenetic are the top line words that I would use for it. But it's very clear that the focus now is on action. I think absolutely right. Everybody knows that we're not going fast enough, and the commitments that we've made aren't bold enough. But on the other hand, they're even with what's been made, there's so many challenges to implementing them. So I just hope that as we go into this next stage, where we're really starting, I guess the rubber's hitting the road, as it were, that pulling in things and initiatives like we're doing with SME data and stuff, hopefully that can kind of help snowball it and get things moving in a quicker pace. Because I think everybody knows we have to go faster, but there are just so many uncertainties out there. It's very difficult to necessarily map that out.
We're going to come back to the kind of granularity of what this means in the next year in terms of your partnerships with Icebreaker One and with Rewired Earth around common data languages and frameworks. So we'll get there in a moment. But back to you, Brendan. Can you just tell me, from a kind of Grantham Institute perspective, from your perspective, what exactly is a just transition?
Yeah, so it is, first of all, you have to start off by saying it is a fairly contested term globally, and that you've just got to be honest about that. And the just transition isn't uniform depending on geography and sector. That's what we always say. That being said, I think at Sharm el-Sheikh, you saw some conflation with the climate justice term. There was the Sharm el-Sheikh financing framework, which really was talking more about north-south inequality of impacts and contributions to climate change, and that's fine, but it has its origins in the workers' movement. So not everyone knows this, but the Paris Agreement in 2015 did reference the need for a just transition. So if anyone ever says they're Paris aligned, make sure they're also just transition aligned as well. But we think about it more. I think we try. It is a workers' movement. It does have its origins in the trade unions. But really, what we think about is more about a people-centered transition to net zero. We really see it as an enabler of that, and looking at it through those most impacted groups, i.e. workers, yes, but also the communities that surround those workers, the supply chains upon which businesses and financial institutions work with, and also very pertinently, as we've seen over the last year, what does it mean for consumers as well? Who's paying for the transition in terms of consumers? So how can we take that framing in terms of those groups to try and make this more people-centered? And if we don't do that, there is a risk that the transition to net zero, that within the UK certainly we've seen legislated and are assuming is going to happen, will either potentially not happen or happen in an inefficient manner. I think we've seen with the Gilets Jaunes movement in Paris and other programs, if you don't put people at the center of both net zero or low carbon policy as well as infrastructure programs, you're not going to bring the people along with you. So The only last thing I'd say is that, and this is maybe a bit controversial, this particular government doesn't particularly love the terminology around just transition, which is fine. Let's call it something else really then. We could maybe call it green levelling up. That's absolutely fine as well. Or I think actually I was at the Conservative Party conference and a Tory MP told me that he didn't like the terminology but understood the concept behind it is as astute change management. So I'm absolutely fine with that. And I think that is what we're talking about really, is that we've seen transitions not be managed well in a very astute manner historically. I think you probably know what I'm referring to. And I think we need to learn the lessons of that to put a more robust change management process in place this time.
Astute change management. I do like that. I mean, we all have buzzwords and terms, and no more so than in banking, where I started my career. Can you tell me, Wendy, Brendan was talking there about this people-centred transition. So from an SME perspective, with the customers that you are working with, what is Santander and other banks like yours doing to enable this transition and accelerate it?
So what the banks are doing, where we're coming from at the moment, is actually thinking about how can we raise awareness? How can we start having good conversations, educating our clients, thinking about what they need to do and where do they start? Because there's a plethora of information coming down at them as to we're going to need this information. And if we've talked about transition plans, we've got the TCFDs at the present time. All of the large corporates are reporting on that, and all of them fit into that supply chain. So they're probably thinking, where do we start? And against that, they have got cost of living crisis, they've got inflation, they've got the situation in Ukraine, they probably haven't recovered from Brexit, additional costs. We've now got strikes. You know, there was a poor woman talking about her card business with the fact that she can't get her products out there because of what's happening with the post office. So we are coming along and saying, well, what are you going to do about going on the road to net zero? And they're going, well, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to pay my wages next week. So we've got to find the way to phrase it so they can see that we're supportive, and how we actually start that, having a good conversation with them and showing them that actually, to Brendan's point, that there is a way to help them show that their business will survive, and that's what their customers want, that's what their employees want, because actually at the present time, because of shortage of employees, you know, you've got a great choice as to where you want to work, and if that business hasn't got purpose and is showing that they're going to make a difference, then they're going to move on to other businesses.
Charlie, can the private sector do this alone, or do we need government support?
I mean, I think there's a fairly straightforward answer to that. I mean, clearly we need government support, and support both in terms of certainty, so, you know, regulation and levelling playing fields. So there is clear line of sight for the large companies for whom regulation will bite earlier, but who have Scope 3 emissions in their supply chains, which will ultimately probably be the main driver of transition for SMEs initially. So you need certainty and transparency so those companies can plan and support their supply chains, and indeed the financial community can see these changes coming down the road. But I think that you also need not just education and communication, but you need to think about directly supporting those SMEs, particularly in sectors that you know are going to be significantly impacted. I mean, I was sort of lucky enough to be in Bays working on the industrial strategy when we thought that was a thing that would be useful. We don't seem to think that anymore. But clearly that there is planning that is required for those sectors, particularly where, you know, change will be radical and it may not involve businesses being able to survive doing what they're doing today. So there's one end of the wedge, which is, are you able to sort of net zero proof what you do today? And there's another end, which is, you know, profoundly, we don't need a fuel additives factory in Teesside because we don't use liquid fuels anymore. What happens to that workforce? What happens to that business structure and its investors, et cetera, et cetera? And I think in some of those cases, you need very significant government planning at a regional and local level to support those businesses affected. So it's a wide range of tools, and ideally you do it as part of a joined up industrial strategy for delivering your domestic net zero outcome. Speaking of useful industrial strategies, we were discussing earlier that Boris Johnson pledged 11.6 billion back in 2019 for international climate finance, and I think we were saying it was 3 billion for nature, 1.5
billion for forests. Can you give us some sort of an update? And that was between 2019 and 2024. Can you give us something of an update, given we're a couple of years into that, on how that's being spent and what's going on with that?
The money is programmed by BEIS and by the Foreign Office, and some of it goes into sort of multilateral organisations who redistribute it. Some of it is spent in specific UK-backed projects or as part of consortia. The spend profile was always a bit backloaded. It remains backloaded over the period, and I think we all need to remember that promise over the next 2 or 3 years, when ODA budgets will be very challenged for lots of reasons that don't need to be unpacked. But I know that money has gone into things like supporting the South Africa JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and some of the other JETP projects that the UK is involved with. It's gone to support piloting of low carbon and net zero infrastructure through the CIFs, for example. At COP, we, I think, released 400 million for Congo Basin, supporting avoided deforestation in the Congo Basin as part of a longer-term strategy to prop up some of the key forest ecosystems. So it's happening, but as with all things governments say they're going to do, you need to make sure that they are continually reminded of the promise.
Clearly, we're talking about international there, but you can take so many learnings from investing in those projects that we can bring back home. So back to you, Heather. In terms of UK SMEs, in the next 12 months, plans that Bankers for Net Zero are making to help with this just transition. Can you go into a little bit of detail on that, and also maybe explore some of the opportunities that you're seeing?
Well, certainly. No, thank you. So I guess for the SME piece, we really started with the fact that banks have a problem right now, and that they need to get information from SMEs, and SMEs don't have time, they're time poor. It's the information that's being asked is inconsistent. And if you're a supplier and you supply for an agricultural supplier and you supply 4 supermarkets and you've got 2 bank accounts, you're potentially being asked for 6 different sets of information, which is bonkers technically by anybody's means. And then you add a layer to this that you've got the banks and you've got the supply chains all asking for this information. We haven't agreed what that looks like, what's proportionate for SMEs, and a lot of the carbon calculators out there are working on estimates. So it's everything's been very top down up to now, and actually in that top down sense, it's the smaller guys at the end that are kind of a bit adrift in that process. So that was really our kind of central rooms. Well, how do we kind of create support in here? And by virtue of the fact that banks have a problem, SMEs have a problem because they're going to be asked for this information, but also from kind of central government and local government perspective, they had a problem in trying to reach SMEs because they're actually just worried about the day-to-day. How do we get them engaged and get the commitments? And so the project that we worked with Smart Data Foundry on was an initial scoping exercise, and where we're going into the next phase now is saying, well, it's not true to say that SMEs don't have anything in common. They've got 3 things in common. They've got an energy supplier, not necessarily a direct relationship with an energy company, but an energy supply. They have to file their taxes, so they've got a relationship with HMRC, which most people kind of try to keep as short and sweet as possible. But they all also have a bank account, and you're actually on your bank account quite a bit, whether that's your online app or whatnot. So we started to think, well, how can we, so first and foremost, work with the likes of PCAF and CDP to say and the race to zero, and the kind of, so what's proportionate for SMEs to actually report on, and then how do we make that as easy as possible for them? That's where we're working with Icebreaker One, and Kevin Starks is in the room here, who helped roll out open banking in the UK. How do we take that process and make it as seamless for an SME to essentially be able to share their data and get some really baselines? And so then we get in a position where, rather than having this kind of top-down reporting, we're starting to build from the bottom up the actual data. So somebody's scope 3 is somebody's scope 1 and somebody's scope 2. So let's start populating that data from the ground up. But at the same time, how do we then think of this as an opportunity to actually, in a behavioural sense, get SMEs engaged, reward for getting more involved, more information. How do we make sure that there's good signposting to government support schemes and local support schemes? So that's really, we're at the very beginning of the process of that. We're setting out the budget and the steering committee and the working groups that we've got, but the idea is that we incubate that, run that as a test, as a pilot in the UK over the next 12 months with the view that we can then kind of set it free as its own entity hopefully by COP28.
That's very nice. A sort of a circle from the international back to the UK and back to the international. I'm going to use that moment to ask if we have got the microphone somewhere. I'm going to open up to questions. Thank you very much. Heather just referenced Gavin from Icebreaker One. I know that he has a burning question / comment. Gives you all time to formulate fabulous questions for me.
Hi there, Gavin Starks from Icebreaker One. Obviously we think this is a fantastic initiative and of its time. I think one reflection is, as you've reflected here, is this has to be for everyone. And as we go forward, if we want to go far, we have to go together. So the question, if we're going to automate greenhouse gas reporting for every SME in the country in the next 12 months, which is a good target, timely, I think, in trying to hit some of the targets. What do you see as what flavour of political support do we need here? Because it was going to require support at cross-party, cross-industry, right the way through the whole of the value chain here to help unlock. So if you could pick one thing that you'd like to see happen in the next 12 months, what would it be?
Charlie, do you want to start? Wendy?
It's a great question. So my sort of initial response would be, we haven't really conflated the opportunity agenda with the regulatory agenda in this space. When the Prime Minister came to COP27, I guess he sort of borrowed his muscle memory from the last time he did international climate stuff in the Treasury and talked about the importance of a green city of London and the growth opportunity for a green city of London. I think that we need to see the conflation of that opportunity with, building best-in-class green services in green finance. And that actually means having a very progressive and ambitious regulatory regime in this space so that the UK can benefit from giving corporates, giving investors and giving SMEs certainty, basically proving the concept of these types of reporting mechanisms and the wider infrastructure of a high integrity space for businesses. And then we will build value in financial services in all of the surrounding services and goods that go with that high integrity system. And moreover, companies will start seeing the UK as an attractive destination to invest because it is doing this first and furthest and therefore is lower risk, and they can bring investments here that make sense in our regulatory environment that might not where there is more risk. So I would like to see politically some of that kind of bringing together of the enthusiasm that HMT and the Prime Minister has over the sort of green city of London, with an understanding that to do that right, you need to get this stuff from the bottom up working in a high integrity, ambitious way.
Wendy, did you?
I'd probably be greedy and say that I'd like all of those three areas that you said to work together. I mean, none of us can do it on our own, whether it's individually or whether it's a bank or whatever. We have to work together. That's why the work that Heather's done on the Bankers for Net Zero has been brilliant, because my fear is that if we have there are calculators out there already, and that they're being used to whether to help people think about offsetting, but I could ask for information, other banks could ask for different types of information. Small businesses can't cope with that. They need to have just one source, and the information then that's going to help them manage what they need to do in their businesses to make sure that we reduce the carbon emissions and really make a difference. So to me, we need collaboration, we need the regulatory space, we need support from the regulator to actually say to us, to help us think about what difference we can do with the financing, because there's no capital benefit at the moment for providing a green facility. So what else can be done to really help us and giving us the right frameworks at the moment? I work in, Santander is owned by a European company. So we are being governed by the ECB as well as the SAN UK, and also we've got entities in the States. 3 different regulators, 3 different sets of requirements. This is an international problem that we really need to change the way that we work to make sure that we work together collaboratively.
Yes, I can promise you that we're not the SEC, we are the SEC. Brendan.
Well, I'm not. Sometimes maybe this is a politician's answer, but I'm not as good on data, so I'm not going to try and answer that question. I think Bankers for Net Zero are leading on that, and will answer it much better. But can I answer the question? What would I like to see in the next 12 months in terms of policy? I think we're quite strong on green finance actually in the UK. I think the government, got to give credit where credit's due, has taken a lot of leadership in terms of the actual greening of finance, right, with the green taxonomy and TCFD reporting and others. I think it's pretty world leading, to be honest, in terms of what's being done. I think what would be really missing is how do we now go from targets and reporting and all that backed up net zero aligned 130 trillion assets under management in GFANs and get it from there into investment portfolios for local climate transitions in the UK. How do you do that? How do you do that in a way? And I think this is a massive, the green growth. I think Lord Stern, who chairs my institute, says this is the green growth. This is the growth opportunity of a lifetime. So cross-party productivity opportunity, growth opportunity within the UK. We've done some research with the Resolution Foundation, which shows that regions of the UK that have historically been characterised by low productivity, Derbyshire, Lincolnshire, parts of Scotland, have a lot to benefit in terms of comparative advantage from a green investment agenda. And what could be done over the next 12 months, if I was being greedy, is the green finance strategy comes out in 3 months' time. You could put a small quantum of money that could provide capability and capacity, technical assistance in regions around the UK so that we could build those investment pipelines that Santander could invest in, asset managers, local pension funds could invest in. It's a blended finance solution as well. It's development finance ideas, but it's just within the UK. So big roles for the BBB, UKIB, but also for some technical assistance funding on the ground. So I just say, look at the Bristol LEAP programme. We should be doing that 100 times over all over the country.
Any other questions? Yes, Greg.
Greg Rosen from SEC Newgate. A slightly broader question, particularly to those of you who were at COP. For UK SMEs who export, so much of their future will be the global economy of the future, and so much of that will depend on the success or failure of the successive COPs to tackle climate change. From having been at COP this time, what do you think the main lessons are from this COP to make the next COP more successful?
Heather, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I guess a lot of people saw this COP as almost a bridge to kind of a further ambition point. And that's something we really need to double down on. And you know, the reason that we've set ourselves a kind of ambitious target of actually getting this thing launched in a year is kind of saying that we need to start holding ourselves to account and doing things faster and showing what we actually can do. I mean, the one thing that the pandemic taught us is actually, if we really need to, we can do things, and we can do things quickly. And so I just say I think that there needs to be a much more focus, that people are getting a bit, that the whole talk era is well and truly over now, and everybody's much more focused on implementation and action, and that's only going to accelerate, and we need to kind of keep that pressure going, certainly from that perspective.
Great. So final question before we have a teensy-weensy break, before we move into nature-based solutions in the UK. For each of you, what practical steps are you taking to make a just transition? And it could be a personal thing, it can be a company-wide thing. Brendan?
Well, yeah, we are going to continue to, hopefully lead the way in a UK basis and internationally on kind of our fajita work, as I mentioned, but also in an emerging market context. We're going to be doing work in India. And hopefully, I think, as you mentioned, Charlie, I think the JETPs are a massive and kind of shining light on the hill in terms of an opportunity, in terms of driving forward a just transition in emerging market context. So we're going to try and get involved in that. And I think really to speak to Heather's point around moving into action, we're very focused on financing a just transition. If you look at our Making Transition Plans Just report, we talk a lot about engagement, strategy, governance. We haven't got as much capital allocation, capital moving behind the just transition. So I think that's what we're really going to be focused on this year. What are the instruments, bonds, funds that can be invested in that actually drive a just transition, whether it's the JETPs or maybe even some sovereign just transition bonds. I think that would be really great, but yeah.
Well, we are in Dubai next year. Wendy.
So we've already started on the journey. So last month we launched an education platform for all of our colleagues. They have been given some training, and the great thing is it's quite incredible how many of them have embraced it, because my view is that we have to know what we're talking about to be able to support our clients. The other thing is that to use the COVID R factor, the R number, if everyone in the bank or in the 1,400 people that work in the corporate and commercial bank really understand what we mean about the road to net zero, what we mean about sustainability, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they can suddenly start talking about that with friends and family. And suddenly we start to see the knowledge and people being inquisitive about this. And then that will hold us all to account to make sure that we do move to the just transition.
I'd say for me, I mean, I'm leaving government at the end of next month. And, you know, we've created a team in the Foreign Office that will continue to push the JETPs forward, which is, you know, one of the really good outcomes from the end of the COP unit. The questions I'm interested in next year and interested in working on in whatever my new job title ends up being, the IFI reform agenda for next year is kind of absolutely vital in terms of making sure that the public finance is flowing from the MDBs into the developed world to create the blended finance flows that were mentioned earlier, but also simply because the politics of the UNFCCC requires the commitment of public monies in order to move forward on ambition. So that's one important part of what needs to work over the next kind of couple of COP cycles. I'm very interested in the actual delivery on the ground of the JETPs. Currently the South Africa JETP is a few pieces of paper and some very detailed and rich discussions, but the real investment has yet to flow. So we have a huge responsibility to make sure it works, because I think there's a proof of concept risk there, and that is a difficult state to start with in terms of unentangling some of the policy and economic issues they have to overcome, not least the social impacts of transition. So I'd like to work on making sure those JETPs can deliver. And finally, and this slightly goes to Greg's question as well, you know, the COP, it was not set up as a process to deliver on implementation. It was set up as a process to ratchet ambition and create frameworks. And, you know, Simon Steele, the new exec sec, spoke a bit about this in some of his speeches at COP. How can you turn this annual event into something which effectively brings the momentum from investors in the private sector into a political space where you galvanize further progress? And, you know, I want to think about, without sort of tearing up the model, because that's just going to be counterproductive, how you evolve the COP model in a way that's more focused on driving high integrity implementation rather than, you know, the sort of slightly confused space that it sits in now.
Well, I mean, other than the actual kind of general work, I think one of the big focal points for us is really on making sure, this goes to the kind of blended finance point as well, that we get some really clear market signals out in spaces so we can actually accelerate. Because there's a lot of money out there, and I'm constantly being told there's a lot of capital out there, but there's still a level of hesitancy and not enough uptake to really get things moving. So we need to really get, you know, so we're obviously just going to be pushing as much as we can for those clear market signals and those the blended finance models and everything else that kind of inspire the action that needs to get taken to start moving things forward.
Thank you, Brendan, Wendy, Charlie, Heather. Thank you very much.